And welcome back, Cor Unum cohort, to session 3 of our philosophy of knowing and being. This time we're looking at the last part of our study of epistemology, that is the study of knowledge. So we're going to wrap up the knowing part and next time move on to being. And so in this session we're looking at reasoning. So remember, we've already looked at ideas. So we had things like the cat, or fuzzy. And then we moved on to judgments, or beliefs, like the cat is fuzzy. So we put ideas together to make judgments or beliefs, and now we're putting judgments or beliefs together to make arguments, to form reasoning. So we're going to have things like, all cats are fuzzy. Fluffy is a cat, therefore Fluffy is fuzzy. So you can see we're kind of building now. So we're talking about reasoning. We also call it argument, right? And we don't mean argument in the same sense as you see in most comment boxes on the internet where people are just calling each other names and things like that, or even our arguments with our family at Thanksgiving dinner. Now, this is the art of logical argument. If only everyone argued this way, the world would be a much better place. I might mention I'm recording these in my basement and home, so we're hoping that we're not interrupted either by a cat pawing at the door or a 3-year-old doing the same. So we'll see how that goes. So let's dive in, and I would suggest with these slides that you do print out and have with you the notes. And the notes are really very thorough. They're basically a script for what I'm doing. But they're going to be beneficial perhaps for these slides because there are some examples that it might be better to see visually, but I didn't want to overload the slides with these examples. So it also might be helpful to have them so you can pause the video and make sure you understand the different examples as I'm going. So I would kind of recommend that at this point. So let's get into it. Let's talk about reasoning. Let's do an initial explanation of the nature of reasoning or rational argument, and we can start with a general description. So by argument, by rational argument, by reasoning, we mean combining judgments in such a way as to justify a new judgment. So we saw last time that judgments are these beliefs where we combine ideas. So a judgment would be something like, the cat is fuzzy. Well, this is saying now we combine those judgments to arrive at a new one. So, for instance, let's take an example. All cats are mammals. There's a judgment or belief. All tabbies are cats. There's a judgment or belief. From those two things, we can justify a new judgment. Therefore, all tabbies are mammals. That's a logical, what we call deductive argument. All cats are mammals. All tabbies are cats, therefore it necessarily follows that all tabbies are mammals. Those first two judgments about cats being mammals and tabbies being cats, those we call the premises. And the last sentence there is the conclusion. So conclusions follow from premises. Premises are the things we know, and the things that in the argument are the accepted known things. Conclusions are what follow from those premises. Let's take another example of a different kind of argument. If justice reigns, then so will peace. But peace does not reign. Therefore, justice does not reign. Notice that's a little different. If you remember from our types of judgment from last time, that first one about cats and mammals and tabbies, those are made up of categorical judgments. This is a hypothetical judgment, if, then. But we've then added the second piece, but peace does not reign, right? So the if, then is if justice reigns, then so will peace. And then what we did is we said we denied the consequent, right? But peace does not reign. Therefore, we also deny the first part, so justice does not reign. We'll look into this more as well. We can do the same thing with the disjunctive judgments. Here's an argument using a disjunctive belief. Either mental states are pure brain states, or our minds are spiritual. There's the either or. Either mental states are pure brain states, or our minds are spiritual. But and here's the second premise, but our mental states are not pure brain states. And from that follows the conclusion, therefore, our minds are spiritual. So we have an either or, we deny one element of that either or, and we're left with the other. We can move on, and we're going to talk about two major categories of arguments or reasoning. We're going to talk about deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So first, let's look at deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, an argument, and by argument all we mean here is a basic unit of reasoning. An argument is deductive if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true also. So that's kind of the definition here of a deductive argument versus, we'll see, an inductive argument. In deductive arguments, if the premises are true, it necessarily follows that the conclusion must also be true. So, for example, in the arguments offered above about cats and tabbies, or about justice and peace, or about mental states and our minds being spiritual, in each of those cases, they are deductive arguments. You can go back and look at each of those, but if you grant that the premises are true in each example, the conclusion cannot possibly be false. The conclusion follows necessarily. So let's look at a distinction we can make in deductive arguments. We can talk about informal deductions and formal deductions. Informal deductions we actually use quite a bit in speech, or that is to say, if we use deductive arguments in speech, they tend to be informal. Informal, that is, arguments expressed in ordinary speech are most often in a form that's abridged, or in some other way not conducive to careful analysis. Such deductions are called informal inductions. Informal deductions. For example, we could have the compound sentence, Socrates is human, so he will die. Right? Socrates is human, so he will die. That's actually an abbreviated deductive argument. It leaves out a premise, which is namely, all humans die. Right? So when I say Socrates is human, so he will die, that so signifies that there's a conclusion. He will die. But you can't get to he will die based only on Socrates is human. You have to add another unspoken premise, that is, all humans die. These are informal deductions. Some of the fun work I remember in my own logic course was getting these informal deductions and trying to work out what are the missing premises or the unstated premises. This is also fun in watching commercials or in political debates, trying to figure out what the unspoken premises are, because often the unspoken premises are the weakest link in an argument. Now, of course, you can probably figure out if you have informal deductions, which are an abridged form, well then formal deductions are just deductive arguments which explicitly state all their premises as well as the conclusion and reveal the actual structure of the reasoning. Those are called formal deductions. So, for instance, all humans will die, all Greeks are human, therefore all Greeks will die, right? There you have the both premises, you have the conclusion, they're all explicitly stated. That could be spoken as an informal deduction just by saying all Greeks, how would you say? I have to think off the top of my head. You'd go the other way, right? Greeks will die because they're human, right? And so the hidden premise there would have been all humans will die. But here on the screen, you see we have all three premises explicitly stated. So that's a deductive argument. That's some of the hard work of logic when you're working through something where it's not stated, is figuring out what the hidden premises are. Well, we can move on from those two types to talk about types of formal deductive argument. And we kind of already noticed these in the three examples right at the beginning. You can have categorical arguments, right? These are arguments consisting exclusively of categorical propositions. The judgments in the argument include or exclude all or some members of categories in or from other categories. That is to say, their categorical judgments make this up. So for example, we saw above, all cats are mammals, all tabbies are cats, therefore all tabbies are mammals. Those are made up of, that argument is made up of categorical judgments. Then we can have, as we mentioned, conditional or hypothetical arguments. At least one of the premises is a hypothetical, that is, if-then judgment. This would be something like, if peace reigns, then so does justice. And then we would affirm, or actually we would deny the second part, but justice does not reign, and therefore peace does not reign. That's what you call the denial of the consequent. That's a formal deductive argument. In these if-thens, the first part before the then is the antecedent. That just means what comes before. And then after the then is the consequent, what comes after. So if peace reigns, then so does justice. The antecedent is peace reigns, and the consequent, so does justice. And you can do two things with these arguments. You could affirm the first part. You could say, if peace reigns, then so does justice. Well, peace does reign, and then you conclude with the consequent, affirming the consequent. Then so does justice. Or as in the original example, you can deny the consequent. If peace reigns, then so does justice. But justice does not reign. And then you can also deny the antecedent. Therefore, peace does not reign. Turns out you can't flip these. You can neither affirm the consequent nor deny the antecedent and come up with a logical deduction. We'll see some examples of that and why not later on. And then we already mentioned the disjunctive. One of the premises is an either-or judgment. This is the example I gave with either mental states are pure brains, either mental states are pure brain states, or our minds have a spiritual aspect. And we can deny one of those, but our mental states are not pure brain states, and therefore we have to affirm the other. Therefore, our minds have a spiritual aspect. Again, you'll notice in all of these examples, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows, necessarily also has to be true. Well, let's look at how we can judge what a good deductive argument is. And there's a two-step process, or there's two senses of what makes a good deductive argument. Because obviously not every argument that sounds like this is equally good. So what do we mean by good? Well, one thing is validity. We talk about an argument, a deductive argument, being valid or invalid. So by this, validity is the logical form of the argument, right? The structure. An argument is valid if the logical form of the argument is correct, right? Given the way that they're structured, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. This is a limited sense of a good argument because it doesn't guarantee that, in fact, the premises are true, nor thus that the conclusion is true. So this has nothing to do with the truth value of the premises. It just has to do with the logical structure of the argument. So hopefully you've got the paper in front of you. I give two examples here. Example 1, all cats are mammals. All tabbies are cats, therefore all tabbies are mammals. That's valid. It also happens, as far as I know, to be true. All the premises are true, but it's valid. Look at example 2, though. All alligators are reptiles. All cats are alligators. Therefore, all cats are reptiles. Now, in this case, the structure of the argument, the logical form, is exactly the same as the one about cats, mammals, and tabbies. It's exactly the same structure. So this is a valid argument. But notice that the second premise happens to be false. So first premise, all alligators are reptiles. True. 2, all cats are alligators. Well, that's false. That's false. And so what follows is therefore false as well. Therefore, all cats are reptiles. This is just to note that validity doesn't have anything to do with the truth of the premises. It's about the logical structure. So one way to challenge an argument is to find an error in its structure, to say that that's an invalid argument. Well, that gets us so far. Another aspect of an argument is then its soundness, which I suppose you guessed has to do with the truth of the premises. If, in addition to the logical form of the argument being correct, the premises are also true, then the argument is said to be sound. Now, of course, what we want to go for is arguments that are both valid and sound, right? We want a proper logical form so that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, but we also want those premises to be true, otherwise the conclusion doesn't really get us anything. This is, again, if we're looking at an argument and there seems to be something wrong, not only can we look at its logical form, validity, but we can also see, are the premises true? Is it a sound argument, right? In the argument above about alligators and cats, the second premise was false, right? So therefore that argument would not be sound. However, if that premise had been true, the conclusion would have followed necessarily, which means that though unsound, the argument is valid. So that's deductive reasoning for us right now. Next, we'll look at some inductive reasoning, and eventually we'll get to also some fallacies.